Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact video series. My name is Ryan Duffy, and this week we're going to talk about someone who we have mentioned in a previous video, but she's definitely someone who deserves her own spotlight. So this week we're going to talk about Mary Richmond, the wife of Dean Richmond. Now we talked about Mary and Dean together in a previous video about the family, but wanted to talk more about just Mary and her own contributions to Batavia during her lifetime, and not just her connection to Dean. So we're going to get into the really amazing life of Mary and her many accomplishments in helping support Batavia, but also bring it up in many ways and allow it to grow. Mary Elizabeth Mead was born on June 21st, 1813 in Troy, New York. Her father was a ship chandler on the Hudson River, but she would suffer major tragedy very early on in her life, as at the age of 9 her mother died, and her father would die actually 3 years later, leaving Mary and her sister orphans. She would be sent to live with her grandparents for a time, but eventually would move in with her older sister in Syracuse. And this is where her and Dean's paths would start to cross. Mary's sister was married to a general named Enos Hopping, who served in the army and would actually go on to serve and would actually die during the Mexican-American War. But Hopping was actually a close friend of Richmond, Dean Richmond, who had moved the family business to Syracuse and was part of the salt industry there. And it was through Hopping that Dean and Mary would become associated and would eventually start courting. Eventually, Dean and Mary would marry on February 19, 1833, in her hometown of Troy. After their marriage, as Dean's business interests took off, the family would move several times before finally settling here in Batavia. They would first move to Buffalo in 1842, and then to Attica in 1846, before eventually settling here in Batavia. They would eventually move into the home we know as the Richmond Mansion on May 31st, 1853. And the reason for a lot of the movements is Dean at this time was getting into the railroad industry and sort of the shipping industry, and was kind of following the tracks and eventually led here to Batavia. Now Mary was the one who was very influential in making the home that they lived in the Richmond Mansion, as she was responsible for a lot of the improvements that were made, the additions, the extravagant rooms, and she was the one hosting all the fancy parties mostly, and entertained many wealthy and famous individuals right here in Batavia. Now Dean and Mary would have 9 children, but only 4 would actually outlive their mother. 2 would die in infancy and 2 would die before their mother passed away. Now Mary would suffer many tragedies with her children, but also with her husband, as Dean would die in 1866 while on a political trip to New York City. And this left Mary devastated, but her early tragedies as a child had really toughened her up, and she was very much an independent woman who could care for the family on her own, and actually grew the family's wealth over time. Now when Dean passed away, the estate was worth a little over $2 million, and Mary used this money to very good use. As in 1887, she actually set aside land on their property to build a library. And she built this in honor of her son, Dean Richmond Jr., who had passed away a couple years previously, and wanted a major dedication to him, as he did love to read and learn. And eventually the Richmond Library was built, a beautiful stone structure. It was an Italian Renaissance style made out of Medina sandstone and Albion redstone, which is the original part of the current Batavia Library on Ross Street. And this would have been located right behind where the former mansion stood. And after the completion in 1887, she donated this library to the school district to use, so all the school children in the Batavia area could have a place to learn and read. And it was really the first formal library here in Batavia. And as we moved into the later years of Mary's life, she continued to put that estate of the Richmonds to very good use and was actually a major promoter and investor in a lot of the early industry that comes to Batavia in the 1880s through the turn of the century, which was essential for the growth of what Batavia would become. She held 500,000 shares in the Johnston Harvester Company, so was one of the largest investors in it, and because of that it was able to grow and eventually become Massey Harris over time. She also heavily invested in the Wire Plow Company, the Baker Gun Company, Batavia Carriage Works, as well as the E.N. Rowell Box Factory. So a lot of those tentpole companies and industries that were here in Batavia in the last few decades of the 19th century. Mary Richmond's money was a big reason why they could survive and grow here in Batavia. Mary was also a big supporter of charitable and other civic organizations here in Batavia, and a lot of those we still see even growing today. She was a major supporter of her church, St. James Episcopal, and allowed that church to grow significantly. She was also a major early supporter of the YMCA here in Batavia and allowed it to continue to grow in its spots across Batavia and is still growing to this day. And she was also a founding member of the Batavia Relief Association, which was meant to help those less fortunate across Batavia. And she's got a very special place here for the Holland Land Office Museum, as she was a founding member of the Holland Purchase Historical Society, which was created in 1893 specifically to save the Holland Land Office building as it was being threatened to be torn down after falling into several years of disrepair. She helped spearhead the effort in order to raise the money to pay off the mortgage here for the property, and ended up being the first president of the society in its initial founding, and was here leading the charge when the building was dedicated as a museum and historic structure in 1894 during Land Office Day on October 13th. Now, Mary Richmond would pass away on April 6, 1895, and her funeral was held 3 days later on April 9th. And out of such reverence for this woman who did so much for Batavia, all of the businesses closed down during the funeral, and Main Street was silent while that was going on. And eventually the funeral would make its way to the Batavia Cemetery, where she would be laid to rest next to her husband and several of her children in the Richmond Mausoleum, which is still a major facet of the cemetery today. So Mary Richmond was really a driving force behind Batavia's growth and its importance to the area. Now, Dean Richmond might have made a lot of the money in the railroads, but Mary put that money to very good use. And even by the time of her death, 30 years after her husband's, she had actually grown the fortune from its significant amount, nearly doubling it in total. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact video series and learned a little bit more about the extraordinary woman that Mary Richmond was. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give it a thumbs up or even subscribe to the channel, as it helps us out a little bit, but also gets you notified quicker once we do release new videos. But as always, the best way to learn more about what we have here at the museum is to stop by and see for yourself, as we can share even more information and stories than just what's shared in these little videos. And if you really are interested in the local history, please consider becoming a member of the museum, as it's probably the easiest and best way to support us as we continue to create this content and preserve the local history of Genesee County.